Have you ever sat quietly in the stillness of night and wondered what stories the old stones of Europe might tell? Imagine this somewhere beyond the sleepy hum of the modern world, hidden beneath ivy-covered walls and long-forgotten ruins. There remains a faint echo, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried by the wind through the cracks of ancient castle walls. If you listen carefully, just carefully enough, you might hear it. It begins not with the loud roar of history, but with the gentle clink of silver against bone, a strange, haunting melody of days long past. In the dim corridors of 15th century Europe, far beyond the reach of common folk and their simple hearths, the noble courts thrived on rituals both grand and grim. Behind tall iron gates and heavy velvet curtains, a peculiar fascination with death took root not in fear, but almost in reverence. And from this fascination, a chilling custom was born, the skull cup. Yes, cups made from real human skulls. They were not crude relics, mind you, but carefully crafted works of art. The raw bone was polished until it gleamed, adorned with delicate silver rims and intricate carvings that turned death itself into a display of elegance. These grim goblets did not belong to the dark corners of dungeons or secretive cults. No, they sat proudly upon the finest banquet tables, their hollow eyes staring into the flickering candlelight as kings, queens, and dukes raised them high in celebration. To drink from the remnants of a life once lived was the ultimate display of power. It was a declaration whispered across a dimly lit hall. Death has no hold over me. And so, in the grand chambers where the air smelled of spiced wine and melting beeswax, the elite gathered beneath towering stone arches, long oak tables stretched across the room, their surfaces scattered with golden platters and bowls of exotic fruits. The flicker of countless candles danced in the polished armor of guards, standing silently in the shadows. Here, amidst the low hum of conversation and the gentle strum of a lute in the corner, the most curious sound echoed above all, a delicate, almost fragile chime. The soft clink of bone meeting silver as skull cups were raised in toasts. The nobles called it a reminder of life, but standing at the edge of such a gathering, watching their pale fingers curl around the cold, hollow remains of another soul, you might have wondered. Was it truly about life, or was it something far darker? Pause. A shift to a warm, gentle tone. But before we wander too deep into those shadowed halls, let me take a quiet moment to welcome you. If you found your way here tonight, perhaps you're searching for a peaceful corner of the world, a place where your thoughts can drift gently like the soft glow of candlelight. And in this quiet space, you are most welcome. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the worries of the day slip quietly into the background like the last flicker of a dying flame. Rest your head, close your eyes if you wish, and know that here, in this moment, you are safe. Together, we'll take a slow walk through the winding paths of history. No rush, no need to hold on to anything too tightly. Just stories, soft, curious stories to keep you company as the night grows long and your eyes grow heavy. So if you're ready, come closer, lean into the quiet, and listen. Shall we begin? The year is 1492, and a grand banquet is about to begin. The hall is alive with the faint rustle of silk gowns and the low murmur of distinguished voices. Above iron chandeliers swayed gently their candles, dripping slow tears of wax onto the cold stone below. Outside, the wind carries with it the scent of damper than far-off rain. But inside, the air is heavy with the sweetness of imported wines and the smoky warmth of roasted meats. At the center of this grand affair sits Duke Albrecht, a man known across the region, not only for his unmatched wealth, but for his morbid collection, one that tonight he is most eager to display. The guests lean forward, their jeweled fingers resting delicately on the edges of the long oak table. And then the servants appear, their hands gloved in soft deerskin carry trays lined with dark velvet. Upon these, the evening's most curious offering goblets made from human skulls. Each is a masterpiece in its own right, polished to a porcelain gleam, their rims encased in finely worked silver. Some bear intricate engravings of vines and roses, others etched with strange Latin phrases only the most educated might understand. A hush falls over the room. The candle flames seem to lean closer, flickering as if eager to witness the moment. Duke Albrecht rises slowly, his ornate robe trailing behind him like a dark river. He lifts his own goblet, a skull once belonging, it's rumored, to a vanquished rival. With a voice that carries just enough gravity to hush the restless whispers he speaks. To life through death. And as the words hang in the thick perfumed air, 100 skulls are lifted high. The sound that follows is unlike any other, a soft, almost musical clink of bone and silver. It is not a loud toast. It is something more delicate, something that lingers, and in that haunting moment, one cannot help but wonder whose eyes once looked out from behind that hollowed brow. Would you have raised such a cup, my friend, if it were offered to you? But do not answer just yet, for the night is still young, and the stories have only just begun. They say that every grand fashion begins with a whisper, and before long, it becomes a roar that echoes through the marble halls of power. But in this case, the fashion didn't glimmer with fine silks or dazzle with gemstones. It chilled the air instead, carrying the faint scent of mortality. It all began with a single daring display, one nobleman's bold defiance of the invisible line that separated the living from the dead. And like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spread across Europe's grandest courts. What was once seen as a grim reminder of death became quite suddenly a prized decoration. The dead had become decor. At first it was subtle. A skull placed quietly on a study shelf, perhaps resting atop an ancient tome. A silent companion for the late-night musings of aging scholars or war-weary generals. These skulls were not yet transformed. They remained as they had been found, rough and bare, their hollow sockets staring endlessly into the dark corners of candle-lit library. But then the artisans came. Where others saw only remnants of the grave, these craftsmen saw a canvas. With skilled hands and eyes for the morbidly beautiful, they began to turn these lifeless relics into objects of admiration. The process was meticulous, almost reverent. First, the bone was carefully cleaned and polished to a soft ivory sheen. Then came the silver work. Skilled metalworkers melted down precious metals, molding them into delicate filigree that wrapped elegantly around the skull's base and crown. Some added golden hinges to create lids, turning the top of the cranium into a curious sort of jewelry box, its secrets forever hidden beneath the curve of bone. And then There were the engravings, Latin phrases worn with time, but still legible, curled along the bone like ivy on ancient stone walls. Phrases such as memento mori, remember that you must die, or sic transit, gloria mundi, so passes the glory of the world. These words were not meant to inspire fear, but reflection. In the flickering candlelight of a grand chamber, they reminded their owners that even the highest crowns would one day fall silent. It wasn't long before these transformed skulls found their way onto the grand banquet tables. Imagine, if you will, a hall stretching wider than the reach of the tallest cathedral. Heavy drapes of burgundy and gold frame towering stained glass windows. Long tables groan under the weight of exotic delicacies, roasted peacocks with feathers still shimmering blue and green, golden platters heaped with sugared fruits from far-off lands, decanters filled with wines older than the heirs who drank them. And amidst this splendor, they sat, the skull cups, like silent monarchs presiding over the revelry, their hollow gazes cast over the gathered nobility. Some cups were small and delicate, said to have once belonged to the remains of poets or artists. Others were larger, rumored to be fashioned from the skulls of great warriors or infamous criminals, their life stories etched forever in silver bands circling the bone. The guests, draped in velvet and lace, their fingers glittering with rings, would wrap their hands delicately around these morbid vessels, lifting them carefully as though in silent conversation with the dead. And when they drank, it was not merely to quench thirst. It was a ritual. Each sip was a quiet triumph over the inevitable. A reminder that for this night at least, the living still held dominion over the mysteries of death. There were even social rules that developed around the use of these macabre treasures. To offer a guest a drink from a particularly rare or exquisitely crafted skull cup was seen as the highest honor and unspoken mark of trust and camaraderie. Declining such an offer, however, was viewed as a subtle insult, a refusal to participate in the shared understanding that life and death were but two halves of the same coin. One curious account tells of a visiting ambassador from the East, who upon being presented with a skull cup during a royal feast, hesitated visibly. He glanced into the hollow basin of the cup, his face pale under the soft glow of chandeliers. The entire hall fell into a hushed tension, and then, with a thin, practiced smile, he raised the cup and drank deeply, his hand steady, even as his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The room erupted into soft, knowing laughter. In that single act, the ambassador had not only secured his standing among the powerful elites, but had proven himself a man unafraid of the ghosts that haunted such halls. But of course, not every skull cup was simply a vessel for wine or honeyed mead. Some held darker contents whispered about only when the candles burned low and the fires dwindled to embers. There were tales of rare potions brewed from forbidden herbs, consumed from these grim chalices during secret gatherings. Some spoke of blood rituals performed under the full moon, where the skulls were said to hold more than just the memories of those who had passed. And in the quiet corners of the grand halls, away from the watchful eyes of the clergy, it was not uncommon to find nobles toasting to health, to fortune, and sometimes to powers best left unnamed. It is strange to think, isn't it, that something as final and fearsome as death could become an ornament, a centerpiece, a conversation starter over the clatter of silverware and the soft strains of a lute. And yet, In those days, the boundary between this world and the next felt thinner, almost as though with every raised cup, the nobles could feel the faintest brush of cold air against their cheeks. A silent guest at every table, and as the night wore on and the halls grew quieter, that presence seemed to grow stronger. But that, dear friend, is a thought for another night. For now, rest easy, and let these echoes of the past drift softly into the corners of your dreams. Shall we journey further, or shall we linger a little while longer in this curious candlelit room? I remember the night as if it happened only yesterday, though the seasons have turned many times since then. I was but a young apprentice then, barely old enough to be trusted with polishing silver, let alone wandering the grand halls where history itself seemed to breathe through the cold stone walls. The year was 1508, and winter had wrapped its icy fingers tightly around the city of Vienna. The Danube River moved sluggishly under thick sheets of ice, and the air smelled faintly of burning cedar and frost. That evening, my master Herr Ulrich, a stern man with a silver beard and a gaze that seemed to pierce right through a man's excuses, had been summoned to the palace. A new commission, he whispered under his breath, his gloved fingers trembling ever so slightly. And me, I had begged to follow. I promised to stay quiet, to remain in the shadows like a good apprentice should. I had no idea that my first true lesson in the craft would be something far removed from the glitter of gold or the gleam of polished silver. The palace loomed before us that night, a monolith of cold stone and darkened windows, its turrets lost in the low-hanging clouds. As we entered through the side gate, I could feel the faint warmth of the interior struggling against the winter's chill. But it wasn't the warmth that struck me. It was the quiet. A kind of quiet that presses against your ears, makes your own heartbeat sound far too loud. The kind of silence that feels watched. We were led by a pale-faced servant through a maze of dimly lit corridors, his lantern casting flickering shadows that seemed to twist and reach along the stone walls. And then we arrived. The doors to the grand hall groaned open, their iron hinges protesting as if reluctant to reveal the secrets kept within. What I saw beyond those doors has never left me. It was a feast, yes, but nothing like the merry celebrations I'd imagined from the stories told by old sailors in the taverns. No, this was a gathering wrapped in solemn splendor. The hall was vast, its high-arched ceilings disappearing into darkness above. Dozens of candles lined the great oak table that stretched almost endlessly before us. Their light wasn't bright enough to chase away the shadows entirely. Instead, it seemed to dance with them, creating a world where every flicker of flame held its own whispered secret. And there, at the center of it all, was the Duke himself, Lord Matthias von Eberhard. A man of commanding presence, even seated his long fingers adorned with heavy rings. But it wasn't his towering figure or his cold, unreadable eyes that held my gaze. It was the object resting before him, a cup, but not just any cup. For the first time in my young life, I saw it real and terrible and beautiful all at once. A human skull polished to a mirror-like shine. Its surface glowed faintly in the candlelight like pale ivory. Ornate silverwork embraced the base and rim, delicate vines and curling patterns etched into the metal as if life still clung stubbornly to death's remains. The eye sockets, They seemed impossibly deep, endless wells of shadow, staring out across the hall, silent witnesses to the living gathered around them. I remember standing frozen at the threshold, my breath caught in my throat. My eyes couldn't leave it. What kind of man I thought could lift such a thing to his lips and drink from it as though it were a mere goblet? But then Lord Matthias reached out his fingers, wrapping gracefully around the silver-rimmed edges. He lifted the skull cup with the elegance of a man well-versed in handling the fragile boundary between life and death. His voice rang out smooth as the finest wine, yet heavy with meaning, to the fleeting glory of life and the eternal quiet of death. The guests rose, each lifting their own strange vessels, some fashioned of crystal and silver others shaped from bone like his. The soft clink of silver meeting bone echoed across the hall, and with that haunting sound, the toast was made. I don't know how long I stood there lost in that moment. My young mind struggled to understand how anyone could see beauty in something so grim. But as the evening wore on, I noticed something curious. There was no fear in their eyes, these nobles dressed in their finest velvets and brocades. No hesitation in their hands as they raised those cups again and again. To them, this wasn't morbid. It was power, a way to hold death at arm's length and say, "You have no dominion here, not tonight." And perhaps there was a kind of strange courage in that. Or perhaps it was just arrogance. Either way, the lesson was carved deep into my memory that night. That was the first time I saw a skull cup, and from that moment on, I knew I would never look at life or death the same way again. If the night I first laid eyes on a skull cup changed me forever, then the banquet of Duke Albrecht etched itself into my very bones. They still whisper about it in hushed voices, those who remember. A night when the line between celebration and ceremony blurred, when the living and the dead seemed to share the same table under a ceiling of forgotten stars. It was the spring of 1512, though the air that night carried the heavy stillness of late autumn. I had since become more than just a timid apprentice. Under Herr Ulrich's demanding hand, I'd learned to mold silver with precision, to etch Latin inscriptions so finely that the letters seemed to whisper against the touch. But nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed in the grand halls of Albrecht's ancestral estate. The invitation itself was a curiosity, a sheet of thick parchment edged with black silk, sealed with crimson wax, bearing the crest of House Albrecht. Herr Ulrich had been summoned to personally deliver a final masterpiece, the Duke's latest and most prized skull cup. We arrived just as the sun fell behind the Carpathian Mountains and a mist began to rise over the moors. The estate loomed before us like something out of a half-forgotten dream, its spires reaching into the fog, its stone walls alive with the murmurs of secrets never spoken aloud. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh and something sweeter, a metallic tang that seemed to linger just beyond recognition. The banquet hall was vast, larger than any I had ever seen. Velvet drapes the color of dried blood hung from the stone arches, and the marble floors reflected the trembling glow of 1,000 candles. Along the endless banquet table, nobles and dignitaries sat draped in their most extravagant attire, their faces pale against the flickering candlelight. And then I saw it. At the very center of the table stood a towering structure, an altar of sorts, though none would dare call it that aloud. Upon it rested a collection unlike any other, a full dozen skull cups, each resting atop ornate silver pedestal. Some were small and delicately carved their origins, perhaps as tragic as their appearance was beautiful. Others were large and imposing, their silverwork almost heavy-handed in its grandeur. And at the very top, centered and elevated above them all, was the Duke's newest treasure, the Grand Cup. A skull unlike any I'd seen before. Its surface was of flawless pale ivory, polished until it gleamed like moonlight. Thick bands of gold circled the base, and crowns set with blood-red rubies that glimmered like living eyes. Across its forehead, etched in delicate silver script, was a single phrase: Memento mori victorium supermortem, remember death, triumph over it. They said the skull belonged to a great warlord, captured and executed by Duke Albrecht's ancestors. Whether that was truth or legend, no one knew for sure. But that night, no one dared question it. A hush fell over the hall as the Duke entered. Tall and gaunt, draped in a flowing robe of deep midnight blue, Duke Albrecht moved with the grace of a man long accustomed to the weight of his own legend. His eyes, cold and sharp as cut glass, swept over his gathered guests before he took his place at the head of the table. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the Grand Cup. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Tonight, he began, his voice low but commanding, "We drink not only to the victories we have claimed, but to the death that forever stalks our heels. To those we have conquered, and to those we shall conquer still." A murmur of approval swept through the gathered lords and ladies. And then, as if by some unseen signal, every hand reached forward. Skull cups were lifted high, their hollow eyes catching the candlelight, their silver rims glinting like thin blades in the dark. The toast rang out as one voice, unified and strangely haunting. To life, through death, and in that moment, the room seemed suspended between two worlds. I watched transfixed as they drank. Some sipped carefully, their gazes flickering nervously toward the Grand Cup. Others tilted their heads back boldly, draining the macabre vessels with the practiced ease of men who had long since made peace with their own mortality, or at least pretended to. But it was not just wine that filled those skulls. There were whispers that night of darker libations, rare elixirs said to grant strength, or perhaps something more troubling. I noticed a curious group seated near the Duke, men and women, dressed not in the bright colors of the season, but in robes of deep crimson and black. Their skull cups were smaller, more intricately adorned. I saw one of them lift his cup, and for a fleeting moment, a flash of something thicker than wine caught the light as it passed his lips. My master leaned close to me, then his voice a trembling whisper. "You've seen enough, boy. Keep your eyes down now." But I couldn't. I was too captivated, or perhaps too afraid to look away. As the night wore on, the merriment took on a fevered pitch. The music grew louder, more frantic. Dancers spun wildly beneath the towering arches, their movements a blur of silk and shadow. And amidst it all, the skull cups continued to pass from hand to hand, their hollow gazes reflecting every flickering candle, every strained smile, every shadowed corner of that cursed hall. I remember stepping back, retreating into the farthest corner I could find. From there, I watched as Duke Albrecht stood once more, his grand cup raised high above his head. "Let this night be remembered," He declared, his voice ringing with terrible authority, as the night we laughed in death's face and tasted eternity. A final resounding toast followed the clinking of bone against silver, rising like a somber symphony. And in that moment, for the briefest heartbeat of time, I swore the shadows around the edges of the hall seemed to move, as if unseen guests had joined the banquet, their hollow eyes forever watching from just beyond the reach of the candlelight. That was the last time I ever set foot in the halls of House Albrecht. They say the Duke's health faltered soon after, and his vast collection of grim trophies was quietly locked away, left to gather dust beneath the estate's crumbling foundation. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the moon is high, travelers passing by that forgotten estate swear they can still hear it, that faint, delicate clink of silver against bone, a toast to life through death. Every tradition, no matter how strange or unsettling, begins somewhere. Like a single ember that sparks a raging fire, the practice of crafting and drinking from skull cups was not born in the grand halls of European nobility, but in the blood-soaked fields of conquest and the solemn shadows of ancient ritual. To understand how the dead became decor and how their remains found their way into the hands of kings and courtiers, we must journey far back beyond the stone castles and cobbled streets, to a time when life was raw, survival was uncertain, and the thin veil between the living and the dead was treated with a kind of reverence modern hearts can scarcely comprehend. The earliest whispers of this grim tradition come from the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where fierce nomadic tribes rode beneath endless skies. Among them, the Scythians, fearsome warriors whose very names sent shivers through the spines of their enemies, held a peculiar and chilling custom. Herodotus, the ancient historian, once wrote of these warriors with equal parts horror and fascination. He described how, after victorious battles, the Scythians would take the heads of their most formidable foes not merely as trophies, but as a means of claiming their strength. The skulls were carefully cleaned the flesh, and memories stripped away and then transformed into drinking vessels. Some were left plain, a stark reminder of the life once lived. Others were adorned with gold and precious stones, becoming grotesque symbols of victory. When a Scythian chieftain raised such a cup to his lips during a feast, it was not just an act of consumption. It was a bold statement: I have conquered you in life, and I shall possess you even in death. This was no idle superstition. It was a deeply rooted belief that by drinking from the skull of a worthy enemy, one might absorb a fragment of their bravery, their cunning, their very essence. Centuries later, as Roman legions marched across the known world, they too encountered these chilling practices on the farthest edges of their empire. And while the Romans considered themselves above such barbaric customs, they could not deny the strange allure these artifacts held. In darkened corners of Roman villas, far from the sanctity of their marble temples, it was said that high-ranking generals kept these grim souvenirs, tucked away symbols not only of military conquest, but of their own defiance of fate. But it was during the brutal years of the Crusades that this tradition found fertile ground in the heart of Europe. The Holy Lands were not only a battleground of swords and faith, but a crucible of cultures and customs. Crusaders returned from distant deserts with more than scars and faded banners. They brought back strange relics, unsettling ideas, and among them, The fascination with memento mori, reminders of death's inevitable embrace. In the candlelit monasteries of France and the windswept cathedrals of England, monks and scholars began to meditate deeply on the fleeting nature of life. Memento mori, they would intone, remember that you must die. At first it took gentler forms, carved skulls placed beside prayer books, paintings of hourglasses dripping away life's final grains of sand. But for the nobility, those who lived with wealth, power, and the unrelenting shadow of their own mortality, these subtle reminders were not enough. They wanted something more tangible, something they could hold. And so the skull cup returned no longer a crude warrior's prize, but a masterpiece of craftsmanship transformed by European goldsmiths into objects of haunting beauty. In the heart of Germany's Black Forest, master artisans began to receive commissions for these somber vessels. Families of fallen knights, unable to bear parting with their loved ones entirely, would have their remains preserved in this most unusual fashion. It was not always a grim token of conquest. Sometimes it was an act of devotion, a way to keep the memory of a husband, a brother, or a fallen son close. A widow might sip sweetened mead from the finely polished skull of her departed spouse during solemn anniversaries, whispering old vows into the silent hollows of the bone. Yet, as with all things touched by power and pride, the practice soon grew darker. By the mid-16th century, these skull cups had become a fashionable curiosity among the European elite. They were no longer tied solely to reverence or grief, but had become bold statements of status power and an almost theatrical defiance of the grave. It was said that owning a skull cup from a vanquished enemy, especially one of noble blood, was the ultimate display of dominance. Whispers tell of duels fought not over land or titles, but over who would claim the right to the head of a fallen foe. Imagine, if you will, two gentlemen standing beneath the pale dawn sky, pistols drawn, or swords gleaming, fighting not just for victory, but for the future centerpiece of their dining hall. And when the deed was done, the unfortunate loser's remains would be carefully prepared, his skull sent to the finest artisan, and months later, presented as a gleaming chalice at the victor's next grand feast. Some historians argue that this grim practice represented a society desperately grappling with its own mortality. In a world plagued by wars, plagues, and the constant shadow of death, what better way to confront the inevitable than by raising it to your lips, looking it squarely in the hollow eyes, and drinking deeply from the abyss? To others, it was simply a macabre indulgence, an artful cruelty disguised as tradition. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that as the centuries turned, the fashion began to fade. The Reformation swept through Europe, and with it came stricter moral codes and the firm disapproval of the church. But the skull cups did not vanish entirely. They were tucked away in dusty cellars, hidden behind locked cabinets, or forgotten in the shadowed corners of grand estates. And there they remain to this day, silent, patient, waiting for curious hands to brush away the dust and wonder who they once were. And perhaps, if you ever find yourself wandering through some forgotten antique shop, or stumbling upon a sealed chest in a crumbling manner, you might find one waiting its hollow eyes, watching its silver rim still gleaming faintly under the dust of centuries. A quiet reminder, dear friend, that no matter how far we believe We have traveled from the shadows of our ancestors. The past is never truly buried. If you think these cups were merely morbid decorations or the playthings of prideful nobles, you would only be half right. For behind every gleaming silver rim and polished bone lay rituals. Rituals both whispered and witnessed, performed under the flicker of candlelight and the unblinking gaze of the dead. You see, to lift a skull cup was not just to drink. It was to participate in a centuries-old conversation with mortality itself. Across Europe, from the icy halls of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched villas of the Italian Renaissance, a curious set of superstitions and rituals grew around these unsettling vessels. Some were simple acts of defiance. Others were darker, more secretive, practiced only in the hidden corners of the grandest estates. One of the most common rituals was known simply as the victory toast. It was said that after a decisive battle or the crushing of a political rival, the victor would gather his closest allies in a private chamber, always by candlelight, always with the curtains drawn tight against the night. There they would raise their skull cups filled with the richest wines, often infused with rare spices or herbs, believed to bring protection and strength. But before drinking, they would recite in unison a chilling phrase: "Through the fall of others we rise immortal." And with that, they would drink deeply, believing that with each sip, they consumed a portion of their enemy's legacy, their strength, their very will. Yet not all toasts were triumphant. There was also the mourner's ritual, a softer, more melancholic tradition, practiced quietly among those who had lost loved ones to war or plague. A widow might sit alone by the hearth on the anniversary of her husband's death, the room lit only by the soft glow of a single candle. Before her, a small skull cup, sometimes fashioned from the remains of her departed beloved, sometimes merely a symbol of him. She would pour a simple drink, often honeyed mead or a mild herbal infusion, and whisper the name of the one she'd lost. 3 sips, one for the life they lived, one for the memories left behind, and one for the hope of meeting again beyond the veil. This was not a ritual for grand halls or public display. It was an intimate moment of remembrance, a way to keep the memory of a lost soul close even as the world marched on. But then, there were the darker rites, whispered about, but rarely confirmed. It is said that in the shadowed societies of old Vienna and Prague, places where alchemy and forbidden knowledge thrived behind locked doors, there existed a ritual known only as the Draft of Dominion. This was no simple toast. It required a skull cup crafted under the strictest of circumstances. The skull must belong to a person of great influence, an enemy vanquished not by blade, but by wit, deception, or political maneuvering. The vessel had to be forged under a new moon, its silverwork etched with specific symbols known only to the most secretive of circles, and the drink, a concoction brewed from rare herbs, bitter roots, and if the old texts are to be believed, a single drop of the ritualist's own blood. Those who performed this ceremony believed that by drinking from such a cup, they could secure their dominance over others, ensuring loyalty where there was doubt, obedience where there was rebellion. Whether this was mere superstition or something more, none can say for certain. But the fear it inspired was very real among the nobility. A curious belief also took root that the manner in which the cup was held determined one's fate for the coming year. Hold the cup with the left hand, and you invited misfortune, for the left was the hand of betrayal and hidden motives. Hold it with the right, and you welcomed prosperity. But should the cup be lifted with both hands, that was an open challenge to fate itself. Those who dared such a gesture were seen as reckless, bold souls, men and women, who laughed in the face of destiny, who dared the heavens to intervene. It is said that Duke Albrecht himself, during his infamous banquets, would lift his grand cup with both hands, his eyes burning defiantly under the chandelier's flickering light, as he declared, "Let the heavens see me drink, and let them tremble." Even the pouring of wine became a ritual steeped in meaning. It was considered bad luck to pour directly from the bottle into the skull cup without first allowing a few drops to spill onto the table, an offering, they said, to the lingering spirits who might be watching. And woe to the man who ignored this custom. There is an old tale told in hushed tones of Lord Thorin von Greifswald, a proud and dismissive man who famously scoffed at such superstitions. During one winter's feast, he poured his wine directly into his skull cup, without so much as a nod of respect. That very night, as the story goes, a sudden illness struck him down. His lips turned blue, and before the dawn, his servants found him cold and lifeless, the skull cup still clutched in his frozen hands. Coincidence, some said. Divine retribution, said others. But from that day forward, no one at the Greifswald estate ever poured a drink without first letting a crimson drop stain the stone floors. And so the skull cups became more than mere vessels. They were conduits, bridges between the world of the living and the silent realm beyond. Every sip taken from them was a small, defiant act against the inevitable end. Every toast echoed with the hopes, the fears, and the silent prayers of those who dared to raise them. It is strange to think of it now in this quieter, more civilized age. Yet sometimes, when the nights grow long and the fire burns low, I find myself wondering, did they truly believe in these rituals? Or was it simply their way of making peace with the unbearable truth? That no matter how grand their halls or how mighty their empires, they too would one day fall silent beneath the earth. By now you may think you've heard the worst of it, that these morbid chalices served only to hold wine mead, or perhaps some rare exotic liqueur imported from far-off lands. But history, my friend, has a far crueler imagination than most are willing to admit. There were nights, dark, unsettling nights, when the skull cups held more than just the fruits of vineyard and vine. They held secrets, they held blood, and sometimes they held something far more dangerous belief. One such story haunts me more than any other. A tale passed down from my old master, Herr Ulrich, spoken only once on a storm-heavy night, when the winds howled like wolves outside his workshop. He told me of the Crimson Circle, a secret society of powerful nobles and influential scholars who gathered not for political games or idle debate, but for something far older, far darker. They believed that life itself could be extended, prolonged through rituals steeped in blood and ancient rites. And at the center of these midnight ceremonies stood the skull cups, not as mere drinking vessels, but as sacred instruments. These were not the ornate, polished goblets displayed during grand feasts. No, the cups used in the Crimson Circle's rites were altogether different, crafted under strict, almost cruel conditions. The skull had to belong to someone who had died violently through betrayal, war, or execution. The belief was simple and chilling. The more violent the end, the more potent the spirit's lingering energy. The cups were adorned with protective runes etched so finely along the bone that they seemed almost invisible until the candlelight caught them at just the right angle. Symbols that no priest would dare decipher their meanings, lost to all but those who gathered in secrecy beneath the earth. It is said that during their most sacred gatherings deep beneath the streets of Prague, the members of the circle would prepare a special draught. This was no wine. It was a thick, dark liquid, a mixture of rare herbs, bitter roots, and a final forbidden ingredient, a drop of human blood. Some claimed it was symbolic, a harmless ritual, meant only to bind the participants together in shared secrecy. But others spoke of darker truths, that the blood was drawn not from their own veins, but from the unwilling, that beneath the grand mansions and stone cathedrals, a hidden world thrived, where the desperate and the forgotten were lured into dark chambers, never to emerge again. During the final moments of the ceremony, the high priest of the circle, always masked his identity known to none, would lift his skull cup high above the gathered assembly. The room, lit only by a circle of flickering candles, would fall utterly silent. Then, in a voice that echoed through the damp stone chambers, he would recite the ancient invocation. Blood remembers, blood binds, blood bestows, and with that, each member would drink their faces pale in the golden light, their eyes wide as if they could almost feel life itself shivering through their veins. But the story does not end there. According to Herr Ulrich, one of the final known gatherings of the Crimson Circle took place on a cold winter's night in 1539. The air was thick with fog, and the bells of Prague's churches had barely ceased their midnight toll. On that night, the circle gathered for what was to be their most powerful ritual yet. They had secured a skull of legendary significance, the remains of a notorious alchemist who, it was whispered, had delved too deeply into the forbidden arts and paid the ultimate price. The ritual began as it always did. The ancient phrases were spoken, the candles burned low. But something went terribly wrong. Witnesses claimed that as the final chant echoed through the subterranean halls, the candles extinguished themselves with a sudden hiss. The air grew impossibly cold, and a low, mournful sound rose from the shadows as if the stone itself had begun to weep. When the torches were relit, several members of the circle were found collapsed on the cold stone floor, their faces frozen in expressions of utter terror. None could explain what had happened. The survivors, those who could still speak, refused to ever meet again. And within weeks, the Crimson Circle was no more. Their secrets, their rituals, their dark ambitions, all buried beneath the city's ancient streets. Or so they say. But even outside these secretive circles, the practice of drinking from skull cups held its own quiet superstitions. It was believed that to sip wine from the skull of a great warrior could impart courage. To drink from the remains of a fallen scholar might bring wisdom. But there was a darker side to this belief, one that spoke of curses of lives unraveled by the restless spirits whose remains had been so casually desecrated. There is an old tale of a nobleman from the Rhineland who commissioned a cup from the skull of his greatest rival, a brilliant and beloved poet named Elias Hartwig. It was said that after the first toast, the nobleman's dreams grew troubled. He awoke each night in a cold sweat, hearing whispered verses in the darkness, the ghostly voice of Hartwig reciting poems of loss and vengeance. Within a year, the nobleman lost his fortune. His lands were swallowed by debt, his family scattered to the winds. And one winter's night, unable to bear the weight of his misfortunes, he disappeared into the Black Forest, never to be seen again. The Skull Cup. It was found decades later, hidden behind a loose stone in the cellar of his ruined estate. The silver had tarnished, but the bone remained as pale as the day it was polished. Some say it still whispers when the night is cold enough. So you see, my friend, these cups held far more than wine. They held the weight of history, the burden of forgotten lives, the silent echoes of men and women who were never truly laid to rest. And perhaps that's why, even now, centuries later, they remain objects of fascination and quiet fear. For who among us could lift such a cup to our lips, knowing the stories it holds, and not feel the icy breath of the past upon our necks? Some commissions arrive quietly wrapped in plain cloth and sealed with a simple wax stamp. Others arrive like thunder on a clear day. The request for the Queen's Skull Cup was the latter. I remember the moment it arrived at my master's workshop. A rider dressed in the deep emerald livery of the royal house appeared, just as the morning mists began to lift. He did not dismount. He simply held out a scroll bound in golden thread, his expression unreadable beneath a polished steel helm. Without a word, he turned his horse and vanished into the fog, as though the very air had swallowed him whole. Herr Ulrich stood silently for a long time, his calloused fingers trembling ever so slightly as he broke the seal. His eyes scanned the parchment, and then he turned to me. "Pack the tools," he said in a voice that seemed both awed and burdened. "We leave for the capital before the sun sets." The queen in question was none other than Isolde of Wesenberg, a monarch both admired and quietly feared throughout the lands. Known for her icy composure and razor-sharp intellect, Isolde had ruled with an elegance that masked her ruthlessness. It was whispered that she never forgot a slight, no matter how small. And though her court was a place of glittering jewels and honeyed words, beneath the silk and lace ran a current as cold and sharp as winter's first frost. That she would request a skull cup was both shocking and, in some ways, inevitable. Our journey to the royal palace took 3 long days, and when we arrived, the grandeur of it nearly stole my breath away. Towering spires reached into the clouds, their stone faces carved with angels that seemed to weep under the weight of centuries. We were led directly to the Queen's private audience chamber, an honor or perhaps a warning in itself. The room was unlike any I'd ever seen. Walls of dark mahogany lined with ancient tapestries, windows draped in rich velvet, so thick that even the midday sun could barely pierce the gloom. And at the far end of the chamber, seated upon a throne carved from pure black marble, sat Queen Isolde. Her presence was unsettling. She wore no crown, yet she needed none. Her simple gown of deep indigo seemed to absorb the dim light, and her piercing gray eyes settled on us with the weight of judgment itself. "I require a vessel," she said, without preamble. Her voice was soft, but it filled every corner of the chamber, one that reflects both the fragility of life and the permanence of my reign. Herr Ulrich bowed low, his head nearly touching the polished stone floor. "And the material, Your Majesty?" he asked cautiously. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to grow colder. "The skull of my late husband," she replied evenly. The words hung in the air, heavier than stone. There had been rumors, of course. King Leopold, a man known for his wandering affections and careless cruelties, had died suddenly the winter before. Officially, it was said he succumbed to a fever brought on by a hunting accident. But those who paid attention, the servants who scurried through the stone halls, the merchants who whispered behind locked doors knew better. Some claimed he'd drunk from a poisoned chalice. Others said he fell to a hunting mishap too conveniently staged. But now, standing in that chamber, I realized the truth was far stranger. Queen Isolde had claimed his remains not for mourning, but for transformation. The commission was clear. The skull was to be polished until it gleamed like moonlit ice. The crown of it encircled with a band of blackened silver, inlaid with midnight sapphires to match the Queen's infamous eyes. On the rim, she ordered a single phrase to be etched in flawless flowing script. Regina Eterna, the Queen Eternal. And beneath that, hidden from casual view, a second inscription meant only for those brave enough to lift the cup and peer inside. From his fall, I rise. The work took weeks. Never before had we handled a commission so delicate, so politically charged. Every stroke of the polishing cloth felt as though it scrubbed away not just the marks of time, but the memory of the man himself. When the day came to deliver it, the Queen inspected the piece with a gaze as sharp as any jeweler's loop. She turned it slowly in her hands, the sapphires catching the faint candlelight, the silver glinting like a blade drawn in darkness. Without a word, she lifted the cup to her lips and took a long, deliberate sip of crimson wine. The silence that followed was profound. At last, she set the cup down gently and looked directly at me, a mere apprentice, standing small and forgotten at the edge of the room. "Tell me," she said softly, "what do you see when you look at this?" My throat felt dry as desert stone, but I forced myself to answer. "A memory, Your Majesty," I whispered, "and a warning." A faint smile touched her lips, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good," she said, "then it is perfect." That cup became the Queen's most infamous possession. She drank from it openly during council meetings, during royal banquets, even on the day she signed the treaty that expanded her empire beyond the eastern borders. And though many spoke of her cruelty, her cold heart, none could deny the brilliance of her reign. She lived for nearly 3 more decades after that day, never remarrying, never yielding her throne. And when she passed at last peacefully in her sleep, they say her will decreed that the cup be sealed away with her in her tomb, a final statement from a queen who had defied tradition, defied her enemies, and for a time even defied death itself. Some say that late at night, if you find yourself wandering too near the royal crypt, you might hear the faintest sound, the soft clink of silver against stone, a final eternal toast from the Queen who would not be forgotten. There are objects in this world that seem to carry more than their weight in silver and bone. They hold something heavier, unseen yet undeniable, a presence, an ill fate that clings to them like the cold breath of a forgotten crypt. And among all the skull cups crafted by the hands of men, none bore that weight more darkly than the one they called The Widow's Curse. The tale begins, as many dark tales do, with a man of ambition, Baron Emil Draven, a name once spoken with both admiration and quiet dread in the corridors of the high courts. He was a man of remarkable charm and ruthless cunning, the kind who could ruin a man's fortune over a casual game of dice, and then offer a consoling arm as if he bore no blame for the ruin. But for all his triumphs in the courts and battlefields, Baron Draven harbored a singular possession, not merely of lands or titles, but of objects, rare, powerful, and steeped in history. It was said he believed that to own a man's legacy, his most cherished possessions, or even his very remains, was to own his spirit entirely. And so when word reached him of a noblewoman whose beauty and grace had captivated the courts, but who met a tragic and untimely death, his interest became something far more dangerous. Her name was Lady Sabine Halbrecht, a widow known for her quiet strength and unwavering kindness. It was whispered that she had refused Baron Draven's advances more than once, politely of course, but firmly enough to leave his pride deeply wounded. Her sudden death just weeks after her final refusal raised more than a few eyebrows. She was found in her private garden, seated upon a marble bench beneath a weeping willow, her head gently tilted, as if she had merely fallen asleep. A single glass of untouched wine sat beside her, and a strange, almost peaceful smile lingered on her lips. The cause of death. Officially, it was called a weak heart. Unofficially, well, the whispers told a different story. What is known, what cannot be denied, is that mere days after her burial, Baron Draven sent for the region's most skilled artisans, and what he commissioned chilled even the hardest of hearts. He demanded a skull cup, fashioned from Lady Sabine's own remains. It was a commission few would have dared accept, but the Baron's wealth was as deep as his vanity. And so, under cover of night, her body was exhumed, and the grisly work began. The skull was polished to an unnatural shine, its surface so smooth it seemed almost translucent under candlelight. A delicate silver crown was forged to encircle the base, inlaid with tiny black pearls, the kind harvested from the darkest depths of the Mediterranean. Around the rim, a single haunting phrase was engraved. What is refused in life is claimed in death. But it wasn't the craftsmanship that made this skull cup infamous. It was what followed. The Baron, proud of his grim trophy, began to flaunt it openly. At every banquet, every gathering of the nobility, he would raise the cup high, a twisted smile playing across his lips as he toasted to unattainable beauty made finally his. And at first it seemed as though his arrogance knew no bounds. But then the misfortunes began. At the first grand feast where he displayed the cup, a chandelier broke free from its iron chains and crashed mere inches from his seat, shattering the long oak table in a storm of splintered wood and shattered glass. At another gathering, the Baron found himself suddenly unable to swallow, choking not on food, but on nothing at all. His face turned a dreadful shade of blue before he collapsed, gasping like a man drowning in open air. Though he recovered, the incidents grew worse. Servants reported strange occurrences in his manor doors that would not stay closed despite heavy iron locks, mirrors cracking without cause, and always the faint scent of wild jasmine in the air, the same flowers that had adorned Lady Sabine's beloved garden. But the most chilling incident was the last. One winter's night, Baron Draven held a private gathering at his estate, determined to reclaim his reputation and shake off the growing superstitions that clung to his cursed possession. He lifted the skull cup one final time, his voice loud and defiant. To triumph over even the grave. And with that, he drank deeply from the cup. Within moments, he fell to his knees. Witnesses claimed his eyes went wide, as if he saw something no living man should ever witness. He began to scream low at first, then louder and louder, until his voice gave out entirely. His final moments were spent clutching his throat, his lips forming silent words no one could decipher. He died there on the cold stone floor of his own grand hall, the skull cup still clutched in his pale, trembling hands. After his death, the cup vanished. Some say his remaining servants cast it into the deepest part of the nearby river, believing it to be cursed beyond redemption. Others whisper that it was taken by a mysterious hooded figure seen leaving the manor that very night, never to be identified. And yet, there are those who claim the cup occasionally resurfaces. A black market artifact passed between collectors too curious or too arrogant to fear the legends. But wherever it may be, one thing remains certain. Those who possess it never seem to hold it for long. For the widow's curse is patient, and she has all the time in the world. If death has always walked alongside mankind, then war has been its most loyal companion. And with every battlefield soaked in blood, and every victory claimed atop a hill of broken spears and shattered shields, there emerged a grim tradition, a practice as old as conflict itself, taking the skulls of fallen enemies as trophies. But this was no mindless savagery. For some, it was an act of triumph. For others, a dark form of remembrance. And for the most ambitious, it was a declaration of eternal dominance. The earliest stories of such trophies trace back to the fierce Scythian horsemen of the Eurasian steppes, as I once told you. But in the war-torn centuries of medieval Europe, this brutal practice found new life, refined, adorned, and paraded before the courts as symbols of unmatched conquest. No longer were the skulls left to bleach beneath the open skies. They were cleaned, polished, mounted upon wooden plaques, or forged into drinking vessels, transformed into objects that would forever remind victors of their power and enemies of their place beneath the heel of history. Perhaps no greater example of this tradition exists than the infamous Battle of Mohács, fought on a sweltering August day in 1526. The mighty forces of the Ottoman Empire clashed with the outnumbered soldiers of the Hungarian kingdom. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, a brutal, crushing defeat for the Hungarians. By nightfall, nearly 20,000 of their soldiers lay dead upon the fields, their bodies left to the mercy of carrion birds and the pitiless sun. But it wasn't the devastation alone that etched this battle into the annals of Europe's darkest memories. It was what followed. The victors, as was their custom, gathered the heads of the most notable fallen leaders and warriors. But these were not left to rot or buried in shallow graves. No, they were carefully prepared, their skulls hollowed and cleansed with precision. And then they were sent back to their homelands, polished, crowned with iron bands, and delivered as grisly reminders of who now ruled the lands their owners once claimed. Some skulls were transformed into goblets, gifted among the highest-ranking Ottoman commanders, each sip from them a silent toast to a vanquished foe. One particular skull, it is said, belonged to none other than Paul Tomori, the Hungarian military commander who had fought valiantly to the very end. His skull was mounted atop a golden stand and displayed in the halls of a Turkish palace, a symbol of victory and a warning to any who dared dream of rebellion. But it wasn't only the Ottomans who embraced this grim practice. Across Europe, victorious generals carried home the remains of fallen enemies, treating them as relics of conquest. In the courts of France and England, these morbid artifacts were shown off during lavish feasts and ceremonies. It was not uncommon to see a grand hall decorated with the skulls of defeated rival lords, their hollow gazes forced to bear witness to the celebration of their conqueror. And as the wine flowed and the minstrels played, the noble victors would raise their skull cups and drink deeply, boldly, proclaiming their dominance not just over the battlefield, but over death itself. Some skulls, however, were not taken merely as reminders of power. They were believed to contain the very essence of those who once wore them. To possess the skull of a brilliant tactician was to claim his cunning. To drink from the remains of a legendary warrior was to draw upon his strength and bravery. And so it became a race among the most powerful houses of Europe to obtain the remains of their greatest rivals, not to bury them with honor, but to use them as tools of spiritual conquest. This belief gave rise to the custom of the victor's toast, performed in secret chambers after great victories. A circle of high-ranking nobles would gather, each lifting a skull cup said to belong to a fallen enemy. Together, they would drink by candlelight, reciting ancient phrases meant to bind the conquered soul in eternal servitude. Through their end, our dominion is sealed. In their silence, our voices rise. Yet for all the grandeur and ceremony, some could not escape the unease these acts left behind. A few victors spoke of restless nights haunted by dreams of their fallen foes. They would wake drenched in sweat, the echoes of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing against the walls of their bedchambers. It seemed that no amount of gold, no number of loyal soldiers could fully silence the weight of what had been done. One such man was Lord Reynard du Montclair, a ruthless commander known for his brutal campaigns in the lowlands of Flanders. After his greatest victory, he had the skull of his most formidable rival, General Alric van der Veen, fashioned into an ornate goblet. He drank from it at every banquet, even as the lines of worry deepened across his weathered face. But in the end, it was not arrows or swords that brought about Lord Reynard's fall. It was madness. They found him wandering the battlements of his fortress one fog-laden dawn. His once proud eyes now empty his lips, murmuring a single broken phrase. He watches me still. He watches me still. He disappeared that very night. The goblet, they say, was found shattered at the base of the highest tower, the silver scattered among the stones, the bones split cleanly in two. And so the wars raged on, and with them, the traditions of taking skulls as spoils of victory. Yet for every triumph claimed, every enemy humbled, the victors could not escape the simple, terrible truth that in the end, all men, kings, and beggars alike become bone. And perhaps that is why these grim trophies carried such power, because they whispered a lesson few dared listen to. That no matter how many battles are won, no matter how many thrones are built upon the broken backs of the fallen, the earth waits for all of us. Not all skull cups found their place atop the grand banquet tables. or within glittering display cases of the powerful. Some were hidden away, locked behind heavy iron doors, buried beneath stone floors, far from the curious eyes of guests and the reach of sunlight. These were the vessels that carried not pride or celebration, but shame, and something far darker. They rested in places known by names, spoken only in hushed voices, names like the Red Cellar, the Vault of Sighs, and most famously, the Forbidden Cellar of House Grunwald. And it was there, deep beneath the crumbling Grunwald estate, that I saw with my own eyes what was never meant to be seen. The House of Grunwald had once been one of the most influential noble families in Eastern Europe. Their wealth came from iron and blood masters of the mines and ruthless patrons of war. But by the time I was summoned to their estate, the family had all but faded into ruin, their halls, echoing only with the ghosts of a once mighty name. The summons was peculiar, delivered by a lone rider at dusk, the envelope sealed with black wax, bearing a sigil long since erased from public memory. Herr Ulrich was long gone by then, and I had earned a reputation of my own, a craftsman of delicate restorations, often called upon to preserve relics that most would rather forget. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was asked to restore that night. The Grunwald estate stood atop a desolate hill, its towers jagged silhouettes against the dying light. As I approached, the sky bled into a deep violet, and a chill settled over the land that seemed untouched by the warmth of any season. The caretaker, a gaunt man named Josiah with eyes too old for his youthful face, met me at the gate. He said little as he led me through the crumbling halls, their once grand tapestries eaten away by time and neglect. At last we stopped before a thick iron door at the end of a forgotten corridor. The air here felt heavier, as if the stones themselves held their breath. Josiah produced a ring of keys, their metal blackened with age, and selected the oldest among them. With a loud, reluctant groan, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. No torches, Josiah warned, his voice barely above a whisper. The air down there, it doesn't take kindly to flame, and so with only a single lantern flickering dimly in his trembling hands, we descended into the Forbidden Cellar. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and bitter, like the faint memory of spilled blood. At the bottom, we stepped into a cavernous chamber carved directly into the bedrock. The walls wept with moisture, and the ceiling hung low with ancient roots snaking through the stone. But it was not the gloom or the chill that made my heart falter. It was the shelves, lining every wall stacked carefully, as if in a grotesque library, were row upon row of skull cups, hundreds of them. Some simple, the bone bare and yellowed with time. Others elaborate, their surfaces gleaming with tarnished silver and faded gold. Many bore inscriptions, some in Latin, others in languages long lost to history. Each skull seemed to carry a silent weight, their hollow sockets dark and deep, as if the darkness itself had chosen them as its resting place. This is where they kept their sins, Josiah murmured. He explained that centuries ago, the lords of Grunwald had participated in a series of brutal political purges. Rivals, dissenters, even members of their own bloodline who stood against them, all silenced. And rather than bury their enemies, the Grunwalds had collected their remains, transforming them into vessels, as both warning and private indulgence. But something went wrong. The family's fortunes began to decline. Strange illnesses swept through their bloodline. Every heir born after the purges was said to suffer from unexplained madness. Visions, voices in the dark, violent rages that came without warning. And so the skull cups were hidden away, locked in this underground vault, forgotten by all but the most loyal of their servants. Yet even Stone Josiah whispered his voice, barely audible over the oppressive silence, cannot contain a curse forever. As I stepped deeper into the cellar, I felt it. A presence subtle but undeniable. It was as though the very air pulsed with the weight of the lives that had ended to fill these shelves. In the center of the room stood a single stone table. Upon it rested the most infamous relic of them all, the Grunwald chalice. It was a masterwork of both art and atrocity. The skull had been polished to a bone-white gleam, its silver crown adorned with blood-red garnets. Around its rim, in tiny, almost imperceptible script, a phrase circled endlessly. Blood remembers, blood returns. Legend held that the last Lord Grunwald Gregor the Mad drank from this very cup on the night of his death. They say he stood alone in this cellar, lifted the chalice high, and drank not wine, but his own blood spilled from a self-inflicted wound. He was found the next morning slumped against the stone table, a smile frozen upon his pale lips. The Grunwald line ended with him. I was asked that night to restore the Grunwald chalice, to polish it back to its former dreadful glory. But as my fingers brushed the cold surface of that cursed relic, a chill unlike any I had ever known swept through me. In that moment I understood what Josiah meant. Some things should remain tarnished. Some histories should stay forgotten. And some doors should never again be opened. I left the Grunwald estate before the sun had fully risen. I never returned. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep feels just out of reach, I swear I can still feel the cold air of that cellar pressing against my skin. And I wonder, are those skulls still resting quietly in their dark tomb? Or have they found their way back into the hands of men foolish enough to believe that the past can be held without consequence? There is a sound unlike any other in this world. It is delicate, barely more than a whisper, yet it carries through vast stone halls and lingers in the corners of darkened chambers. A sound so soft you might miss it amid the crackle of a dying fire or the rustle of heavy velvet curtains. It is the unmistakable clink of bone-meeting silver, and once you've heard it, truly heard it, you will recognize it anywhere. I recall the first time that sound settled into my memory. It was during a winter's evening in the court of Lord Maximilian Veriholt, a man known as much for his grim curiosities as for his vast estates. His halls were filled with wonders that bordered on the disturbing ancient sarcophagi, crumbling relics from forgotten cults, and of course his infamous collection of skull cups. But it was not merely their presence that chilled the bones, it was how he used them. On the night in question, a rare snowfall blanketed the countryside. The roads leading to the manor were buried under silent drifts of white, and the world outside seemed to vanish beneath a soft, endless hush. Inside, however, the halls were alive with flickering firelight and low murmurs. A select few had been invited, men and women of influence and dark fascination. As a guest of Lord Veriholt's personal artisan, a position I'd reluctantly inherited, I was permitted to stand quietly at the edges of these gatherings, unseen, yet always present. That night, Lord Veriholt unveiled a set of 12 skull cups he called the Choir. Each one belonged, he claimed, to a fallen philosopher or poet. Their remains had been gathered over decades, their skulls turned into the most delicate vessels ever crafted by his court silversmiths. The rims were thin, almost impossibly so edged with filigree so fine it seemed spun from spider silk. Silver chains connected each cup to the next, and when they were lifted in unison for a toast, that sound, a gentle crystalline chime, the faintest clink of bone and silver. It was beautiful, and yet it was terrible. I stood there in the shadows of the hall, watching as the noble guests lifted their cups, their eyes reflecting the firelight, their lips curled in faint, knowing smiles. Each held their vessel carefully, reverently, as if they cradled the thoughts and dreams of the long dead in their hands. And then, at the command of their host, they tilted their wrists in perfect unison. The cups touched, and that sound echoed again, light as a sigh, cold as the grave. Lord Veriholt spoke, then his voice low and even his gaze sweeping across his assembled guests. Drink, my friends. Let us honor the brilliance that once shone from behind these hollow eyes, and let their silence now give voice to our own ambitions. And they drank. Some sipped their wine, slowly savoring the taste and the moment. Others drank deeply, as if trying to drown the unease that clung to the air like a fog. But none could deny the power of that sound, the soft music of silver against bone. It was as if, for that brief and dreadful moment, the dead themselves had joined the feast. I often wondered why that sound lingered in my mind long after the night had ended. Perhaps it was because, unlike the loud clamor of war or the mournful toll of funeral bells, this sound did not demand attention. It crept softly into the edges of one's consciousness, a gentle reminder that the past is never as far away as we like to believe. That behind every grand toast, every triumph celebrated beneath glittering chandeliers, there is a shadow and a hollow eye watching. Years later, when I thought such nights were long behind me, I heard that sound again, not in a grand hall or among gathered nobles, but in a quiet village chapel, far from the reach of kings and courts. An elderly priest, knowing my strange history, had summoned me to examine an old relic hidden away in the crypt below his chapel. It was a single skull cup, resting upon a plain stone altar, untouched for generations. No jewels adorned it, no silver chased its rim. It was simple, almost humble. But when I lifted it gently, turning it in the soft glow of a flickering lantern, the cup shifted ever so slightly against the stone, and the chain attached to it stirred. And there it was again, that same delicate sound, the ghost of a toast long forgotten. A reminder that no matter how far one travels, no matter how many years pass, some echoes never fade. And so, my friend, if ever you find yourself in a forgotten place, a crumbling estate, a dust-laden cellar, or a chapel where the air feels too still, listen carefully, and if you hear it, that gentle clink of bone and silver, you will know that you have stumbled upon a memory the world itself has tried to forget. But remember this: some sounds are not meant to be answered, and some toasts are best left unanswered. Like all things born from extravagance and shadow, the era of the Skull Cup could not last forever. The world changed. It did not happen all at once, not with a single proclamation or grand act of penance, but slowly, like the extinguishing of candles at the end of a long haunted night. One by one the flames dimmed, and with them the fascination with death turned from obsession to shame. The very hands that once lifted skull cups in triumph began to tremble beneath the weight of their own history. The decline of this grim fashion began not in the castles of the powerful, but within the austere stone halls of the church. By the late 17th century, as the Age of Enlightenment began to cast its first tentative glow across Europe, the church, long a silent witness to these dark indulgences, found renewed purpose in cleansing the moral fabric of society. The Council of Minden in 1692 was perhaps the most significant turning point. Though rarely spoken of today, the council gathered in secret away from the public eye. There, high-ranking clergy debated not just matters of doctrine, but the troubling rise of what they called necrovanitas, the vanity of the dead. The skull cups were at the center of their concern. Artifacts that had once been seen as reminders of mortality had become in their eyes blasphemous symbols of arrogance and defiance. To drink from the vessel of the dead, one bishop famously declared, is to mock the Creator's design to reduce his greatest work to a mere cup for wine and pride. Soon after, quiet but effective orders were dispatched across the realms. Monasteries began to collect and destroy skull cups wherever they could find them. Some were melted down for their silver, others were shattered and buried beneath church foundations. In certain cases, entire collections were sealed away in hidden crypts, locked behind iron doors and left to fade into legend. The nobility, ever mindful of their public image, began to distance themselves from the practice. Banquets grew more restrained. The lavish toasts, once performed with hollow-eyed vessels, were replaced by the clink of crystal and fine porcelain. Where once a nobleman might have proudly displayed a skull cup upon his mantle, now it was quietly hidden away, an uncomfortable relic of a more indulgent, reckless time. But there were deeper forces at work beyond religious decree. Science, too, began to challenge the morbid romance of death, as scholars and physicians turned their eyes toward anatomy and the mysteries of life. Death was no longer seen as a realm to be toyed with or dominated. It became a subject of serious inquiry, something to be understood, not celebrated through macabre displays. The rising belief in human dignity, even after death, slowly took hold across intellectual circles. And with this new respect for the remains of the departed came a growing discomfort with the practices of the past. What had once been seen as powerful and brave began to appear vulgar, even barbaric. By the early 18th century, the creation of new skull cups had all but ceased. Those that remained were tucked away in the dark corners of aging estates, their stories forgotten or deliberately erased. Occasionally, one would surface found by a curious servant in a locked chest, or unearthed during the renovations of a crumbling manor. And when they did, the reaction was no longer awe or fascination, but unease. Collectors began to view them as cursed artifacts, dangerous reminders of a time when power went unchecked, and men believed they could cheat death by lifting it to their lips. Yet, despite the decline, the legacy of these grim relics refused to die entirely. Even as the Enlightenment bloomed and the old superstitions gave way to reason, A quiet fascination endured beneath the polished veneer of civility. Private collectors, often men with a taste for the forbidden, sought them out in secret. Behind locked doors and velvet curtains deals were made. Ancient skull cups passed from one trembling hand to another, sold for sums so large they would make a pauper weep and a king blush. But these gatherings were no longer held in grand halls or amidst roaring fires. They took place in candlelit basements behind shelves of innocuous books, or beneath the stone foundations of ancient libraries, where the air smelled faintly of forgotten pages and lost souls. And so the skull cups became ghosts in their own right. Artifacts without a home, passed from generation to generation like an inherited sin. Those who owned them rarely displayed them. Most locked them away, fearful of the stories that clung to their hollow gazes, stories of misfortune, madness, and unexplained deaths. And yet, for all the fear, none could bring themselves to destroy them. Perhaps they believed that to destroy such an object was to release whatever it held trapped inside. Or perhaps, deep down, even in the most enlightened hearts, a flicker of ancient superstition still survived. Today they say there are only a handful of authentic skull cups left in the world. Most reside in the hidden collections of private families, names you would recognize if I dared to speak them aloud. Others lie forgotten in museum vaults, too controversial to display, too dangerous to discard. And a few, a precious cursed few, remain lost, waiting in the dark beneath floorboards, hidden behind false walls, or buried deep beneath earth that has forgotten their terrible presence. But if you ever find one, if by some strange twist of fate your hands brush against cool, polished bone set in tarnished silver, listen closely. Because even after all these years, you might just hear it. That soft, unmistakable clink, the final echo of a forgotten age. It was a cold, colorless spring when the final commission arrived, a season that seemed caught between forgetting winter and fearing summer. The letter bore no crest, no signature, only a deep red wax seal pressed into the shape of a circle, unadorned, unremarkable, yet somehow final. The words were few. One last word. For remembrance. For closure. Payment will arrive before the dawn. I should have refused. By then, I had sworn never to lay my hands on another relic of that kind. Too many nights spent in uneasy sleep. Too many times waking with the taste of cold iron on my tongue and the strange sensation that unseen eyes watched from the dark corners of my workshop. But something about the letter compelled me, a sense of inevitability, as though this was not an invitation, but the final thread of a story long in the weaving. The materials arrived under the cover of night, brought by two men whose faces I could not clearly see beneath their dark cloaks. They said nothing, left no names, and when they departed, the fog seemed to close around them like a living thing. The crate they left behind was small and remarkably plain, yet when I opened it, the contents took my breath away. Inside lay a skull, its surface smoother and whiter than any I had ever seen. It seemed untouched by the decay of time, as though it had been waiting for this moment alone. There was a note tucked beneath the cloth that lined the crate. From him who chose to remain unknown. Let his final act be the silence he could never find in life. No name, no origin, only the weight of the request. For days I did not touch the skull. I left it resting on my workbench, covered gently with a sheet of linen, as though it were a sleeping guest, rather than the remains of a man long gone. And each night, as the hours stretched thin, and the wind whispered against the shutters, I heard faint echoes, soft rhythmic, the imagined clink of bone meeting silver. It was as if the craft itself called to me. Or perhaps it was the skull. On the seventh night, I began the work. My hands, though weathered by years of delicate labor, trembled as I picked up the tools one final time. This was not to be a grand, ostentatious piece. No gemstones, no heavy silver bands. The request, though unspoken, was clear. This cup was meant for simplicity, for remembrance, not display. I worked through the night and into the fragile hours of dawn, polishing the bone until it gleamed faintly in the candlelight, etching a single unbroken band of silver around the rim, delicate, unadorned, like a wedding ring made for no hand to wear. And then, upon the inside of the cup, hidden where only the drinker might see, I inscribed a final message. In silence, I am forgiven. When the work was complete, I sat for hours simply staring at it. It was the most perfect thing I had ever created, and the most terrible. Because as I gazed into those hollow eye sockets, I realized something unsettling. This skull did not seem old. There was no brittleness to the bone, no weathering from long years beneath the earth. And in the stillness of that moment, I wondered, had this truly belonged to a man dead for centuries, or someone whose life had only recently slipped away? The thought chilled me more than the cold spring air that crept through the cracks of my workshop walls. I did not have to arrange delivery. By the next night, the two cloaked men returned their arrival as silent and inevitable as before. They took the cup without a word, left a satchel heavier than any payment I had ever received, and disappeared once more into the fog. I never saw them again, and though I tried to put it from my mind, rumors began to surface within weeks. Stories of a powerful man, his name never spoken aloud, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. His estate abandoned his heirs, silent, his once formidable presence erased, as though he had never existed. And with him, so too, vanished the last skull cup, my final creation. I have not crafted another since, nor will I. The tools remain locked away, the forge cold, the workbench untouched. And yet, sometimes late at night, when the fire dies low and the wind picks up around the corners of this old house, I hear it again. That faint, delicate sound, the gentle clink of bone and silver. A reminder that some creations, no matter how beautiful, are born from sorrow too deep and sins too old to ever be forgotten. And so I wait for the day when my own silence must be kept, and perhaps for the final commission that awaits every man, the one no hand may refuse. Time has a curious way of softening the edges of horror. What was once scandalous becomes historical curiosity. What once stirred fear becomes the subject of museum displays and academic papers. And so it is with the skull cups, the macabre trophies of a forgotten age. They now sit behind thick panes of glass, their cold, hollow gazes dimmed by the years, their silver bands dulled by the slow breath of centuries. They gather dust, and yet, even in stillness, they have not lost their voice. Visit any of the great museums of Europe, the British Museum in London, the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna, the Louvre's hidden archives, and if you know where to look, you will find them. Not proudly displayed, of course. Most remain tucked away in the farthest corners, hidden behind collections of ancient armor and faded scrolls. To acknowledge them too openly would be to admit that civilization, for all its refinement, once drank from the empty remains of its own vanquished. But for the curious, and for those who know how to read between the lines of the past, they are still there. Quiet reminders. Ghosts wearing the thin disguise of historical artifacts. I remember the last time I saw one displayed openly. It was at a small exhibition in Prague, tucked into the corner of a museum, too proud of its Gothic architecture and too burdened by its lack of modern funding to hide its darker pieces. There it sat inside a plain oak case, the velvet beneath it faded to a dull, lifeless gray. No grand placard, no dramatic lighting, just a small, almost apologetic card that read, "Memento Mori drinking vessel, 16th century, origin unknown." I stood before it for nearly an hour watching as visitors passed by with barely a second glance. Children pressed their faces against the glass, their parents hurrying them along with soft admonishments. A few curious scholars paused, tilting their heads, their eyes scanning for some academic insight. But none of them saw it the way I did. They saw an artifact. I saw a confession. It's easy to dismiss these objects as relics of a less civilized time, to view them through the protective lens of history, and believe we have moved beyond such grotesque fascinations. But I wonder, have we really? We may not drink from skulls anymore, but how often do we raise a glass to victories earned at the expense of others? How often do we toast to success, built upon silent suffering, to fortunes made from the invisible labor of forgotten hands? Perhaps the skull cups have simply changed shape, traded their bone and silver for the thin glass of modern ambition. And perhaps that is why, even today, they continue to gather dust, but never truly disappear. Some say the last great private collection was dismantled decades ago, after its reclusive owner passed away under what the newspapers called unusual circumstances. But if you listen closely to the whispers of art dealers and private historians, you'll hear otherwise. They say the collection was not destroyed, but scattered, sold off piece by piece to those wealthy enough and daring enough to acquire them. Hidden in plain sight behind locked doors in lavish homes, resting beneath cloth covers, on the highest shelves of private libraries, tucked into false compartments behind ornate fireplaces. And once in a while, just once in a while, one resurfaces. An estate sale in the French countryside where a buyer stumbles upon a strange, heavy box tucked behind moth-eaten drapes. A sealed crate discovered during the renovation of a crumbling manor house untouched since the 18th century. And when the lid is lifted and the linen wrapping falls away, there it is, bone polished smooth by hands, long turned to dust, silver dulled, but still strong, etched with words no one dares speak aloud. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the air grows colder, as if someone still lingers. Do these objects truly hold power? Is it mere superstition that makes the air feel heavier in their presence, that turns a simple touch into a shiver down the spine? Or have they absorbed, through centuries of silent witness, the sorrow, the ambition, and the final moments of those who became unwilling participants in their creation? I cannot say for certain, but I know this much. Whenever I see one, whether resting quietly behind museum glass or hidden away in the forgotten corners of some grand estate, I find myself pausing my hand, instinctively moving to my chest as if to guard against a chill. And I wonder if these relics truly have gathered dust and nothing more. Why is it that even now in the brightest, most modern halls, their hollow eyes seem to watch? Why is it that even in their silence they seem to whisper? Perhaps they are waiting for the day when history forgets to lock them away again, when curiosity overcomes caution, and when for the briefest of moments a trembling hand reaches out to lift one from its resting place. And once again, the gentle clink of bone and silver echoes through the halls of the living. There is a moment just before sleep claims you, when the world grows unnaturally still. The clock forgets to tick. The wind holds its breath outside your window. And even your own thoughts seem to hush, waiting for something. It is in that fragile pause in the hush between the beats of your own heart that you might hear it. Soft as a sigh, light as a feather falling through still air. The faint, unmistakable sound. The clink of bone and silver. You might tell yourself it's nothing. The old timbers settling a forgotten chain, swaying gently in the draft. And perhaps it is. But then again, if you listen closely enough, you may realize that sound does not quite belong to this modern world. It is older, a sound carried through centuries, etched into the very stones beneath your feet, and the earth upon which your home was built. A sound left behind by those who could not or would not be forgotten. They say that every object crafted by human hands carries with it a memory. A wooden chair creaks with the weight of all those who have sat upon it. A stone wall groans faintly with the secrets it has overheard. And the skull cups, they carry the heaviest memories of all. Not just of those who held them, raised them in triumph or defiance, but of those from whom they were taken. Every toast made from them echoed not only through great halls, but through the very fabric of time, leaving behind a trail that even now, centuries later, has not fully faded. So if one night, while the world sleeps, and the air feels just a little colder than it should, you hear that faint chime, do not be so quick to rise from your bed and search for its source. And if you do, tread carefully, because there are places, forgotten corners of ancient estates, sealed chambers beneath old churches, long abandoned wine cellars, where such sounds do not come from the living, they come from what was left behind. I have often wondered if it is regret that makes them linger, those souls tied to the relics of their former lives. Or perhaps it is pride, a refusal to be erased, to be cast aside like the tarnished silver that adorns their remains. You might pass by a locked cabinet and feel the air grow heavier, or stand before a display in a museum and feel a shiver crawl up your spine. That is not mere imagination. That is memory trying to reach out. And sometimes, just sometimes, the past does more than whisper. It calls, in the flicker of a candle, in the sudden, unexplainable chill of a sunlit room, in the echo of a sound that should not exist. A soft clink, a reminder that history is never as far behind us as we like to believe. If you should ever find yourself wandering through an old marketplace deep within the forgotten quarters of a city, and you happen upon a stall where the air feels oddly still, where the vendor speaks in hushed tones and his eyes dart toward the shadows, and if you see it there, resting beneath a cloth, frayed by age, A cup too pale to be ivory, too perfect to be porcelain, its rim glinting faintly with the dull glow of tarnished silver. Turn away, my friend. Turn away before curiosity outruns wisdom, because some toasts were never meant to be made again. And some cups still wait for a hand brave or foolish enough to lift them once more. But if against all reason you do reach out, if your fingers brush against that cold, familiar smoothness, and the weight of it settles into your palm like a forgotten promise, then listen in that final moment before you lift it to your lips, before the past and present meet again. If you listen closely, you just might hear it, that soft, inevitable chime, the gentle clink of bone and silver, the last echo of a forgotten age. And when that sound rings out once more, know this: the toast is not just yours. It belongs to every soul that lingers every life, reduced to bone and memory, waiting patiently for their stories to be told again. So, my friend, as you drift now into sleep, let the past rest with you. Let its echoes soften its sharp edges dulled by the grace of dreams. And remember, should you ever wake in the small hours of the night and think you hear that sound just once, just faintly, it is nothing to fear. It is simply history, reminding you that it is never truly silent, and that somewhere beneath the dust of forgotten places, the final toast still lingers, waiting. And so, after all these years of walking through the shadowed corridors of history, touching the cold surfaces of relics long abandoned, and feeling the lingering breath of forgotten souls, I find myself wondering, were these skull cups merely objects of power and pride? Or were they silent confessions of fear? Fear of death, of insignificance, of being forgotten. Perhaps the nobles and kings who lifted those grim chalices weren't as fearless as they appeared. Perhaps they too stood at the edge of the unknown and felt the same chill that you and I feel when we ponder the end. And so they drank not to defy death, but to make peace with it. To hold it in their hands, even for a moment, and say, I see you. I know you're waiting, but tonight, I live. As for me, I have touched these relics. I have felt their stories in my hands, and I have learned that the most powerful echoes are not the loudest, but the quiet ones, the ones that linger in the spaces between heartbeats, in the gentle clink of bone and silver. A reminder that life is precious precisely because it is brief. That the most meaningful toasts we make are not those shouted over grand feasts, but the silent promises we whisper to ourselves in the dark. To live fully, to leave behind something kinder than what we inherited. And when the time comes, to let go in peace. So if you've traveled this far with me, through the corridors of history, through tales of triumph and tragedy, I leave you with this. Drink deeply from the cup of life, but let it be filled with compassion, with kindness, and with memories worth toasting to when the final candle burns low. And may your echoes long after you are gone be gentle, just like that delicate sound, the soft clink of bone and silver, forever remembered, forever at rest.